This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one decision, one country, or one headline you missed while scrolling. This is about a system that only works when you're not paying attention, because the most dangerous failures don't arrive with sirens. They arrive quietly. They arrive disguised as relief. Right now, something is being made cheaper on purpose. Cheaper enough to feel like a gift, cheaper enough to change how you live without asking your permission. And when that happens, history shows us something unsettling. The danger is never the price itself. The danger is what rearranges itself around that price while you're distracted. You're not supposed to feel panic yet. You're supposed to feel comfortable. That's how this always begins. Stay with me. Because if you understand why this feels good now, you'll understand why it never ends that way. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that takes us to the part no one ever explains. What actually controls this system isn't governments. It isn't elections. It isn't even energy companies. It's price signals at the margin, tiny movements, 1 or 2%, just enough to feel temporary. That's all it takes to bend an entire economy. Because modern life is built on assumptions. Assumptions about distance, assumptions about fuel, assumptions about what tomorrow will cost. When prices fall suddenly, the system interprets that drop as truth, not as a warning, as permission. Industries don't ask why it's cheap. They ask how long they can build around it. Refineries reconfigure. Manufacturers redesign. Developers push cities farther outward. And none of it is reversible on command. Here's the part people miss. The system doesn't need stability. It only needs confidence. Confidence that today's price will still exist long enough to justify permanent decisions. Once that confidence locks in, control quietly shifts, not to who produces the most, but to who can remove supply at the worst possible moment. That shift is almost invisible while it's happening. And that's why the most dangerous change is the one that feels gradual. Which brings us to how this started changing without anyone noticing. There was a time when energy shocks were sudden, obvious, impossible to ignore. That's not how they work anymore. Now the shift happens slowly enough to feel natural, normal, almost earned before people organize their lives around scarcity. Short commutes, smaller vehicles, local supply chains. Now, the assumption is abundance, endless mobility, distance without consequence, growth without friction. And the transition didn't come with an announcement. It came with discounts, with headlines celebrating relief, with the quiet reassurance that this time the system had figured it out. That's what makes slow change so dangerous. You don't react to it. You adapt to it. By the time the new normal feels permanent, it already is. Infrastructure has moved. Capital has committed. People have rearranged their lives around a price that was never meant to last. And here's the trap. The longer stability continues, the more fragile it becomes. Because every additional month of calm deepens dependence. Nothing breaks yet. Nothing looks wrong. But under the surface, flexibility is disappearing. Options are narrowing. And the system is quietly training itself to fail all at once. That's when the first shock always arrives. Not as the crisis, but as the warning people misread. And that warning is where we're headed next. The first shock never feels like danger. It feels like luck, a sudden drop, a visible win, something concrete you can point to and say, this helps prices fall fast enough to make headlines, fast enough to change behavior, fast enough to convince people the system has finally loosened its grip. This is where celebration replaces caution. Spending increases. Commitments get bigger. Decisions get longer term. And crucially, this shock is treated as the event itself. The story, the payoff. But it's not, because nothing structural has improved. Nothing fundamental has changed. Only the signal has, the system hasn't become safer. It's become quieter. This is the moment when analysts start declaring a new era, when warnings sound outdated, when anyone raising concerns is accused of missing the upside. And that's the tell. Every historical fracture begins with a phase that looks like relief, a phase where pain disappears just long enough for dependence to deepen. The shock isn't the drop. The shock is what gets rebuilt while everyone is distracted by it. And once that rebuilding starts, the next phase is already locked in. Because beneath the celebration, a mechanism has just switched on. And almost no one notices it happening. This is the mechanism. And it's colder than people expect. When prices fall, production doesn't just continue. It reorganizes. The cheapest sources stay online. The expensive ones quietly shut down. Not forever, just long enough to matter. On paper, this looks efficient, rationale, market discipline at work, but efficiency has a side effect. It concentrates power because every barrel that disappears isn't gone evenly. It's removed selectively from places that take time to restart, from systems that can't turn back on overnight. At the same time, demand doesn't pause. It accelerates. Cheap energy doesn't get saved. It gets absorbed by bigger vehicles, longer supply chains, farther distances between home and work. So while supply becomes thinner and more fragile, consumption becomes broader and more rigid. This is where the balance breaks. The system starts to rely on fewer inputs to support more output, which means control shifts to whoever can interrupt that input. They don't need to dominate the market. They just need to matter at the margin. And once enough of the economy depends on that margin, leverage appears. Quietly, mathematically. Inevitably, nothing collapses yet. But the system has crossed a line. From flexibility to exposure. And exposure is what turns a future disruption into something much worse, which is exactly what the next shock exploits. Now it speeds up, signals start contradicting each other. Prices are low, but volatility rises. Confidence stays high, but margins thin. Small disruptions suddenly matter. A delayed shipment, a temporary outage. A geopolitical headline that would have meant nothing before. Each one pushes the system harder than expected, not because the shock is big, because the buffer is gone. Producers hesitate, consumers don't, supply responds slowly. Demand doesn't respond at all. And that's when spikes stop behaving normally. They overshoot. They stay elevated longer than models predict. They punish everyone who assumed elasticity still existed. This phase never announces itself. It looks like noise, like random instability, but it's not random. It's the consequence of months, sometimes years of decisions made under the assumption that cheap conditions were permanent. This is where forecasting breaks, where experts argue, where policymakers underestimate timelines. And here's the part that matters most. Once volatility becomes visible, it's already too late to reverse the structure that created it. The system can't unwind on demand. It can only react, and reactions under pressure are always expensive. This is the point where people start asking whether something has gone wrong. But the real damage was locked in long before anyone noticed the tremor. And that brings us to who actually absorbs the impact when the system flinches. This is where it reaches you. Not in theory, not on a chart, in your daily math. At first, it's small, a few extra dollars here. A budget adjustment you tell yourself is temporary, but nothing else gets cheaper to compensate. Housing stays fixed, debt stays fixed, time stays fixed. So the pressure concentrates. You drive the same distance, you work the same hours, but more of your income evaporates just to stay in place. And the trap reveals itself. You can't easily move closer. You can't instantly change vehicles. You can't renegotiate the systems your life now depends on. This is how structural shifts become personal crises. Not because you made bad choices, because the price that shaped those choices changed after they became permanent. And here's the emotional truth people don't like to admit. When this happens, it feels isolating, like a private failure. It isn't. It's the moment when a systemic design flaw lands on individual shoulders. If this feels uncomfortably familiar, that's not coincidence. It's pattern recognition. And recognizing it early is the only leverage individuals ever get. Stay with me. Because once this pressure spreads beyond households, it stops being local. And that's when the consequences multiply. Once this pressure escapes the household, it doesn't stay contained. It travels. Supply chains feel it first. Transportation costs ripple outward. Margins vanish in places no one associates with energy. Food prices respond. Construction slows. Manufacturing timelines stretch. And here's the critical shift. What began as a domestic adjustment becomes a global signal. Other economies, watching the same price movements, react in parallel. Producers hedge. Importers rush contracts. Exporters reconsider commitments. Coordination breaks down, not because anyone panics, because everyone acts rationally at the same time. That's how local stress turns systemic. One region tightens, another compensates, a third hoards. The market stops clearing smoothly and starts lurching. And once energy costs reprice globally, everything tied to movement reprices with it. Goods, labor, capital. This is where instability stops being about affordability and starts being about trust. Trust in delivery, trust in contracts, trust that next month will resemble this one. When that trust weakens, volatility feeds on itself. No single actor is in control anymore. Everyone is responding to everyone else. And that's the dangerous part. Because systems built on synchronized assumptions fail hardest when those assumptions fracture simultaneously. What comes next isn't collapse yet. It's acceleration. From here, the system has only a few directions it can move, not outcomes. Paths. The first is adjustment. Prices rise, but slowly enough for adaptation. Consumption tightens. Production responds in time. The damage is real, but contained. This path requires coordination, restraint, and luck. And historically, it's the rarest. The second path is erosion. Costs climb unevenly. Some sectors absorb the hit. Others break. Growth stalls without a clean crash. Living standards slip quietly. Nothing fails all at once, but nothing works quite right anymore. This is the long grind, the kind people argue about for years while the damage compounds. And then there's the third path. Rupture. A sharp disruption. A sudden withdrawal. A moment where supply vanishes faster than adaptation is possible. Prices spike beyond expectations. Confidence collapses. Institutions scramble. This path isn't chosen. It's triggered. And the uncomfortable truth is that the system's recent behavior determines which path remains available. Every decision made during the cheap phase narrows the exit ramps. Every assumption locked into infrastructure reduces flexibility later. Right now, all three paths are still open, but not for long. Because the longer the system delays recognition, the fewer gentle outcomes remain on the table. And that leaves one final question hanging. Not about what will happen, but about when. There's a reason this pattern keeps repeating. Not because people are careless, not because institutions are incompetent, because systems reward short-term relief and punish early restraint. When prices fall, the pressure disappears. Attention drifts. Warnings lose urgency. And by the time the cost returns, it arrives carrying consequences that can't be unwound. That's the unresolved danger here. Not that prices might rise, but that entire ways of living quietly reorganize themselves around a condition that was never stable. Once that happens, the future stops being flexible. Nothing in this system fails dramatically at first. It fails by becoming brittle. And brittle systems don't bend, they snap. So the question isn't whether this cycle completes. History suggests it always does. The question is whether you recognize which phase you're living in before it feels obvious. Because when it does become obvious, the options shrink. The reactions get expensive. And the warnings all sound late. This isn't an ending. It's a pause before the next move. If you want to understand what breaks first, what holds longest, and where pressure concentrates next, stay with this. Because the most dangerous moment in any system is the moment everyone believes the danger has passed.